with your e-reader.
I must say, as we get started here, I hope you realize that Richard is a great columnist at Publishing Perspectives, where I'm editor-in-chief. This is, of course, the news medium of Frankfurter Buchmesse. About 14 years old now, the thing is, and I feel like we've been doing it together for at least 14 years.
Yeah.
But Richard is really a great read, and in fact, he has a piece coming very shortly after we do this today, and I know you'll want to have a look. He brings us a wealth of background to everything that's happening today, and great insight, and we have some really addicted readers, and so we enjoy having Richard with us. And Michael is a great friend. We must see each other all over the world. It's incredible. We have been on the same stage so many times together. It's kind of great. We can catch up with our conversations as if we never stopped, right? But Michael, in having brought Kobo to such a force as it is, now Rakuten Kobo, of course, has proven several things. One, in that there is not just one game in town. And two, this is what I hear all out in the world everywhere I go, Kobo, 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 not the other word. It is really interesting, the international diffusion that he's made, because my mandate as editor-in-chief is the international. I'm, of course, attuned to this. And this is the first company that they mention to me wherever I am. If I go to Taipei, they tell me about Kobo. It is a fascinating progression that you have. How long have you been doing this, Michael?
Since 2009.
Since 2009. It has taken that long. This is good to remember too, right? That's 2 years after the Kindle, just for those who like to think in those terms, right? And so it is a fascinating thing because they're working, of course, both in the devices as well as in the content. And this has remained a feature of the company, where others have dropped away and changed that model. This has stayed static. So two wonderful people, two very interesting folks, and I think you told me this is your first time at READMAGINE as well, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, this is great. We're introducing so many people to READMAGINE too, so we're glad to have you both. In what we're doing today, we kind of walked into our topic today, the age of anxiety and publishing in an age of anxiety. This actually comes from London. We can blame this on London Book Fair, where we all had, in fact, a great fair. There was a lot of business going on. Things were actually upbeat. When I would ask, is it a good fair? Which means, of course, are you getting any business? The answer was yes, yes, yes. And yet, there was this frenetic energy going on. Everybody felt, I think you called it chaos at one point. Everybody felt driven by something, and a sort of a panicky edginess. I think we talked about it, Javier. People were just, you know? And it's always busy, but this felt scary. This felt very pushed. And it continued right on into Bologna. We were feeling it there as we walked around, this odd edginess going on. You can, of course, always assign this to the idea that publishing is a very emotional industry. As an editor at Faber and Faber once said to me in London, we take everything that happens very hard in publishing. And that was in the middle of the digital business, right? And things were very, very, very difficult and dark at that time. And of course, we're fine. But it is very interesting that this seems to be a point of a dynamic of urgency that's going on under this, but we don't see the dark hand of digital or something right over us necessarily. It's a little hard to get a fix on just what's causing this sense. Is it just the waiting for the next shoe to fall, something's going to happen? Or is there actually another element to this? And that's sort of what we started by wanting to get to when we began talking about this as a concept to go at it. And I heard an interesting thing on Monday. I was at Lillehammer at the World Expression Forum, which I recommend to you if you have a chance. We call it Wexfo. If you have a chance to go to the World Expression Forum, created by Kristen Einarsson in Norway, usually happens right in May when everything else does, but it's well worth it. Miha Kovac was a curator at Frankfurter Buchmesse in October with the Slovenian guest of honor. Did a magnificent job on the programming and brought forward something called the Ljubljana Manifesto. This is a call for what he calls higher reading. Now, in the United States, we say this is critical thinking, but he's tied it to the reading element. And what he's saying is that unless we are able, as citizens, to read long form, to understand how to analyze and think through the content we're getting, we're not going to have the democracies we want. that this is actually tied into very intimately the problems we're having with an autocratic rise in that sort of energies. And so there's a great pressure to make this start moving, and the International Publishers Association is working with this to try to forward the effort as fast as possible and get a focus to what we mean when we say, oh, we want more kids to read. No, we need them to read long form, we need them to read now, and we need them to read smartly. So it's an interesting thing. But what Miha was saying as he went is something that I called his Marshall McLuhan moment. You know, Marshall McLuhan said so many great things. Once, what he said, he died in 1980, of course, but what he said about new media was that they all work us over completely. And when Miha was talking at Lillehammer and speaking to the audience there, very, very high-level policy people, saying in terms of technology and how that's affecting reading and publishing, he said, all technologies are political. Now, I think this may be a clue to what we're seeing, to this energy, this pressure. I think that in many parts of the industry, we're feeling the approach of political as it gets closer to us. Whether you work in fiction, it doesn't matter, whether you work in nonfiction, whether you're putting out political books, or whether you're actually just feeling this in your staff that worries and maybe resists the entrance of a book into the list that they feel is not politically correct for what they want. We're seeing all of this happen throughout so much of publishing. Political seems to be getting closer to this industry. As a journalist, I think this is a good thing. Many other people feel less good about that. And so I think one of the things I'd like to do to get us started here then is look at that question of political, see if we think, we'll test whether that's part of the urgency we're feeling. Richard, by doing this, I'd like to start with your observation that during the pandemic, UNESCO, and I saw these facts too, coming across, had realized that literacy was taking a hit. That somehow, during the time when they were supposed to be reading more at home, right, when we thought everybody's reading, literacy must be going through the roof, it was going down, which is very interesting. What did this tell you? What did this mean, Richard?
Well, during COVID, I think most publishers recorded terrific results.
Exactly.
Which they extrapolated to prove what a wonderful job they were doing. The good thing about publishing is we're fundamentally optimistic. We see a statistic and we bend it to our own desires, wishes. So we saw our results and said, well, aren't we doing a great job? Well, I'm now a grandfather 8 times over. And I can assure you that my grandchildren, don't see books as the principal source of their education, knowledge, understanding. They simply don't. They're not illiterate, thank God, although sometimes one wonders. But they seriously don't see books as the source. Given that, I think we have, to some extent, failed. And the UNESCO numbers were, I think, a wake-up call. Governments around the world talk about literacy. Charities talk about literacy. There are many, and we could go on forever about them. The truth is that probably, I can't prove it, J.K. Rowling has done more for worldwide literacy, or at least getting kids to read, and indeed adults. My mum, at the age of 85, discovered Harry Potter. So she took up reading again. So I don't have an answer to the question, but I do feel that we can be very smug, complacent, and we should not be. Does that answer it?
I think that's a great response, as a matter of fact. And one of the things that Miha was saying about literacy in terms of the Ljubljana Manifesto is that it doesn't mean you have to have them reading treatises, from the ancients. It actually just means that if they can get their way through Potter in a very clever way and understand what they're getting and let those words work in their heads, then the literacy is occurring that's going to make them more critical thinkers. As children develop like this. One of my own personal concerns, I'll mention very quickly in this, is that logically and rightly we focus so much on children in terms of publishing and trying to make sure that we are working with reading children and pushing this. I'm worried about the adults that we've let wander away. There is one good thing about the streamers. Netflix is doing one good thing in that it is introducing people to translated literature, because it will bring world literature into view in so many countries at once. And suddenly they're all reading a Turkish book because they love the show they saw on Netflix. This is interesting. I'm hearing it in many different markets of the world. But beyond that, I'm worried that the adults have wandered away and we're so busy working with the kids. And we've forgotten, God, we've got to get the guys back. We've got to get the women and the men back into reading. So we need to work on that. But Michael, one of the things that you were talking about with when we, of course, came into AI when we were chatting, we were saying that copyright protection issues, yes, we understand this, but what you said to me, I think that's where the battle lines being books that AI probably ended up being drawn is not making books. In other words, the question is not, can AI make a book, but AI making other things that people find as compelling as books. This may be the adult population I'm talking about too. What is your concern when you think that AI's biggest impact could be on us, not the books, but something else it's doing?
Well, I think to what you were talking about at the beginning around that low-level state of collective anxiety.
Yeah.
I think that some of the conversations around AI are the catalyst for that.
Right.
The slide that Madeline put up near the beginning of her presentation showing, 1999, or sorry, 1996, 97, 98, 99,
right.
2007 were two points where books and publishing had to adjust to a significantly new paradigm of discovery and distribution.
That's right.
And that was, I wasn't in publishing, but two people who were, I don't think a very relaxing time for publishers going through that process. And so now we're coming to another point where we don't know exactly how these tools and techniques are going to impact us, but we know that they work primarily off of text. We know that they are tied deeply into the ecosystems that we use to gain and sort of focus attention. Mm-hmm. So one way or another, that's going to shift our landscape again. And that's, that's anxiety making, I think. But I'm less concerned that AI is going to write the next great novel than I am that it becomes another complicating factor in our fight for attention.
Right.
And that, I think if there's one thing that we're figuring out over the last decade, it's that, nobody owes us their attention, that we have to, as authors, as creators, as publishers, as retailers, we have to fight for it against all of the other often very well-financed, very profitable companies that want to kind of package and sell that attention. And that's where we're having to learn a whole new set of tools and techniques to be able to in many cases, punch above our weight to get and earn and keep that attention for the long-form reading that you talk about.
Mm-hmm. Michael is one of the first people who started using the phrase attention economy. I think that was the way you were putting it back at Klopatech in Berlin. Years ago, he got a lot of blank looks in the room, of all things, because it was still too early for many publishers. This was entirely publishers in that conference. For many of the publishers, at least in the German market at that time, to think of all of entertainment as being their competition. They looked at each other as their competition. They might understand that somebody was watching too much TV in the younger part of the family, but beyond that, they had not caught on to the fact that the entire media combine is what reading is suddenly up against. And this is something we've never seen in history before. I mean, this is not an old thing. This is a new energy coming at us from a very, very big aggregate industry. It's hard to even see. It's hard to get your head around. It's so pervasive, and it's so much on our smartphones here. But yet that is what's developing. And I think Michael was so good at trying to get this across, and he really did. You saw lights going on in these minds as they went, my God, he's right. This is going to take my lunch. And these things have happened in many cases, not in some other cases, but they look threatening. in some. I wonder if the day may not come where many great stories actually, and I mean coming from publishers, start in film and television and then come out as a book. There may be a reverse process to the tie-in, if you will, in that these things are deliberately created and developed in concert with a studio, with a house, with a streamer, by a publisher working together. There's one publisher that has its own prime studio system anyway, and has already worked with one imprint they've set up to do exactly that. It's called Topple, is the imprint at Amazon that is there to create those pieces for the studios. Fascinating thing, but no, that's real good. And Madeline, before we chat together here, which I think would be good for us to do instead of going one by one, the one by one thing I wanted to do with you, if I may, is the generational question, because I've touched on it in my concern about the readership. But in terms of your authors who are coming to you and or not coming to you, maybe they're the dithering ones, what do you see in terms of generational understanding of the author's equity concept and the model? Do they get it across the ages or not?
Yes, I would have predicted that young authors would get it, old authors wouldn't, and that turns out not to be the case. It turns out that either the author is going to get it or they're not going to get it, and the demographics, there's no rhyme or reason to it. I do think that this generational, the theme around the age of anxiety, that it feels to me as though with authors, with publishers, with consumers, there is sort of a tale of two markets going on,
right,
where you have, and again, speaking from a US perspective here, so much of what we published and sold for a long time was driven by the tastes of the baby boomers. And particularly, male baby boomers who would buy the big presidential biography, for example, that would take years to research, et cetera, and then sell very well. Those books are not selling as much anymore because those consumers are actually the ones who are not necessarily very loyally buying books.
Right.
And so you have a lot of, I hear anger from authors and publishers who have grown up believing that that is publishing. And so things must be wrong if this very important book is not at the top of the bestseller list. Mm-hmm. So a lot of anxiety in that population, while this entire other population, it's sort of like the muggles and the wizards in Harry Potter, the two populations who aren't really talking to each other. The other population made up of younger female, 15 to 28-year-old consumers who are buying trade paperbacks, influenced by social media, and buying them in droves. They're going into physical bookstores. I mean, you go into a bookstore in the afternoon on a weekday, and at the checkout line, there are people with 8 books.
Wow.
And if you look at the aggregate numbers, the industry is quite robust. It's just that what is selling is changing, and you have, as happens in all political systems, when you have people who are losing power, they get quite angry about it.
Yep.
So.
Fascinating. Do I hear you saying something there?
Yeah. Madeline identified the changes, and I think they're spot on. I also think that the concept of authors' equity will play to that new audience we're talking about. I think the issue is that a sustainable audience? Is that going to change? And how quickly we can change as an industry? As you said, presidential biographies, autobiographies, don't sell what they used to sell.
Right.
And yet the ex-presidents still expect the same advance. So there's something amiss in this thing, and we are very slow to change. I run a business rather similar to Madeline's. I don't do it on profit. I don't share profit because, in my mind, profit is a slippery thing invented by governments as a way of taxing people. And so I don't really know what profit is, but I do know what revenue is, and I'm very happy to share that.
And that was political, by the way.
So I think the fundamental thing is we are changing. The major publishers on the trade side are changing very slowly. Not least that they are driven, I think probably not so much in the Hispanic market, but definitely in the English language market by literary agents, who we haven't mentioned, but whose job is to extract as much money up front as they possibly can get, because they have a budget to reach, because they've become corporates as well. So they are driving a lot of the non-change, if that's the right way of putting it, and they themselves are becoming anxious. I'd be very interested. I mean, it's interesting if we put the same questions to a panel of literary agents, what their reaction would be.
What is the reaction of a lot of agents to your
To ours?
to your model, Madeline? Because that is an interesting question.
Yeah, very similar to the answer about the authors, that there are those who absolutely get it, are in favor, and not for all of their authors, but who see us as being a solution for some of their clients who have grown weary, disenamored of the existing system. And so even if they've sold many copies, and the agent would love to sell the next book for a very large advance, if the author doesn't want to, that doesn't do the agent any good. So for some agents, we're definitely in the mix. For others, we are absolutely not in the mix. There's a lot of we have good relationships with them. We're very friendly, but I will be shocked if they ever submit anything to us proactively.
Even for profit sharing, not even for ready money.
Well, they want the combination of the advance and the profit share, and then there are those in the middle who may not have come to it themselves, but maybe their author has rung up and said, I've read about this thing. Why don't I'd like to try that.
It does beg the question. In my case, half the books that I've published under the new model come through literary agents. But the interesting thing is that on the next book by their author, by that author, they've sacked their literary agent because they don't want to pay the 15% commission.
Yeah.
And who can blame them?
So that's what Mensch publishing means.
Yeah.
The boutique publisher that Richard runs now is called Mensch. How many books now are out?
We've got about 20.
About 20 of them, yeah. Works very hard at it. We hear a lot about it in the column, as a matter of fact. It's a good house. Michael, what are we looking at when we look at the digital formats? Because something that Madeline just said about the younger group going in to get the physical copies of books and everything really rings true. And one of the things we see in the aggregate increase in audiobooks, which of course in my market in the United States keep going up by double digits, and yet their share of the market doesn't seem to move much farther. It's kind of pacing the other things. Yeah. Where does this stand? I mean, is there a breakout point coming for digital, or is that younger generation actually taking us the other direction?
Well, it's been interesting because digital formats and ebooks specifically have been the first digital transformation, kind of from analog to digital, that weren't driven by 18 to 25-year-olds. The median age of an ebook reader is like more likely to be 50 than 30 or 40, and in some markets is even higher than that. And that's both people who are gravitating towards ebooks because you're like me, and at a certain point you needed these, and it's really nice to make fonts bigger, along with the younger readers living not just in a gift economy. So parents love giving books to children, buying books for young people, but also in a borrowing and collecting economy. You like to be able to be in your room and see all of your books out in front of you. That tends to kind of degrade over time. So you see that happening a lot in 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds. And then you go out on your own and you have to buy books for yourself, and then you start looking for what's the cheapest way that I can get this. that leads people often into things like digital borrowing and digital libraries, and then once you've got some disposable income, you start buying them yourselves. What's been interesting, though, is seeing that starting to move around a bit. So as we brought out our new lineup of e-readers this year, we introduced Color, which got graphic novels and manga and that kind of thing into the mix. But it also got young readers, TikTokers, influencers who annotate books, who write about their experience of the book in the book that they're reading, and capture that and share it. We had to make clear plastic cases for e-readers for the first time because they're getting decorated with stickers and designs, and people want to be able to show that. And that was not a thing that we ever had to do before. And we were seeing that showing up in social media. It's like, okay, I guess we better make these. So the demographics move around all the time. And again, what's great for us in that is that we're in the end in the long form reading business. Like this is not where you go to consume your social media. So it's all of these small individual good signs of people wanting to be in that experience, of people having the capacity to sustain an immersive reading experience and wanting to be inside it and finding different ways to engage with it that maybe weren't their parents' way. I was told never to write inside your books. Now people can, and see that as a way of engaging more richly with the material.
What's fascinating to me. I lost my mic.
Yes.
Oh well, I'll talk loud.
Oh,
What's fascinating.
backup mic is coming.
Alex is coming with another one. There we go. I broke that one. There we go. It works. This one's good. I'm keeping this. No, what's really interesting to me about this is that for so long, there were people who told us, the experts always said, no one can do immersive long-form reading in a digital format. In fact, there's still people who resist retention in audiobooks. There are people who say you're not really getting into anything in an e-book. And yet we're seeing immersive reading in these formats, right?
Yeah, and I don't think anyone said that who had any kind of direct experience with the format. But I mean, when we were starting in 2009, Kobo wasn't called Kobo; it was called Short Covers, because we actually believed at the time that we would be like chopping up pieces of literature into smaller pieces and selling them like a chapter at a time.
Right.
No one wanted that, like absolutely no one. And we thought, well, people are reading on phones and they're reading on little screens; they'll want little things to read. The best-selling books in the first 3 years of the company were like 800 pages, 1,000 pages, and 700 pages.
Yeah.
And then we went through all of the big YA books that were like these absolute. We had Twilight, we had 50 Shades of Grey, like all of them, by the way, doorstops. And so it wasn't a case of people not being able to sustain a long-form reading experience. Mm-hmm. They were just looking for a way to do it more conveniently where you didn't have to carry a brick around with you all the time, and it turns out those were really good for that.
Right. I think this is really interesting, and I think going back to the need for long-form reading, critical thinking, higher-level reading, as we're calling it, we're going to have to get better at understanding what's available to a consumer and what different needs may be there so that consumer can find the way that makes sense for him or her to do a long-form read and to keep the mind able to immerse and to experience that. We're probably very close to time here, but before we stop, I just want to ask each of you, if you can feel something of the anxiety we're talking about right now, this odd energy that's a little hard to put a finger on, what is it in each of your own experience that seems to be perhaps the most compelling pressure? Which one is coming closer to bothering you right now than anything else? Madeline, you're opening a new company. Everything bothers you.
Yes,
I know, right?
everything bothers me.
She hasn't slept for 3 months, you said.
Yeah.
But no, what do you think might be the most disturbing energy you're feeling out there?
I mean, I think I don't know that it's disturbing, it's just prevalent that we are in this period, and Richard was right to bring up agents. where every single member of the value chain needs to be thinking about how are we adding value going forward. And it's clear how an author adds value. It's clear how a reader adds value. It's everybody else who needs to be really being honest with ourselves about which things are we doing because we know that they're the right thing to do versus what are the things that we're doing because we just always have done them that way.
Yeah.
And that's, change is hard for everybody.
It is hard. Boy, that's incredible. That's actually very interesting. I like what you're saying. Michael, what do you feel it might be it?
I don't know. I think anxiety is just the water we swim in this business, and at a certain point, the thing that allows you to stay in it is that you build a set of coping strategies around it that just lets you go, okay, this is what we're doing today. I think to pick up that theme of the value chain, like we know that as waves of technology hit this particular beach, disruptions happen in different places. And in the book industry, technology hasn't disrupted it the way that it has in music or the way that it has in video. We didn't see bookstores go away the way that they did in music retail or the way that they've done in video rental. I think that disruption is much more likely in the relationship between the author and the publisher. And what Madeline's doing is one of the ways to try to address that. We address it on the self-publishing side by giving people a distribution platform. But I don't assume that that's the only place that disruption is happening. So as we're looking at different ways to personalize the experience for people, as we look at how we address that idea of micro markets and micro interest, we as a retailer earn our customers' time by being useful to them in navigating the millions of books that are available. And so as new ways of discovering books come in, as new ways of focusing people's attention come in, we're constantly having to look at whether or not we're the best way for somebody to find the next book that they're going to read. And watching that, calibrating that, trying to make sure that we stay apace of that is what keeps me up. It's like we have to earn our place in the available time of a reader every day.
And you're right, because really digital is at the coalface of discovery and discoverability, whether we've got it right or not.
Well, I think any retailer is at the coalface of discovery.
Right.
It's that each of us has to address it in a different way. If you're in physical retail, it's can I provide a space that is engaging enough and beautiful enough and curated enough that it makes people divert into that space. Right. For those of us on the e-commerce side, it's can we take all of the available tools and techniques of digital and figure out better than someone else, here's the next compelling book that you should read. And can we do that in a way that's different than the person who's a click away.
Mm-hmm. One thing I like, too, is that over the years, even in this conference, we've heard discoverability so many times, questions and anxieties around that. We've heard the middle of the value chain, between the author and the reader. What's there? Is it worth it? What are we all doing in the middle, right? I think a lot of these things really are so cyclical to us, and questions we just never seem to solve, Richard, give us another unsolvable, and what is your last pressure to mention of the day?
Well, I'm trying to think in terms of anxiety, and it coalesces around speed and sustainability, which work together. So, if you want to publish a novel in the United States, you have to give Barnes & Noble 9 months' notice? Yeah? The world is changing rather more rapidly than 9 months. If you want to produce a novel worldwide, you will print a large number of copies and you will send them on boats and planes to Australia, and Australia will publish a month later than the USA. The marketing you've done in the USA will have little impact in Australia, or vice versa. We are not fast enough. We really have to relearn. And we're making things worse for ourselves. because we now have editorial committees that only meet X times a year, and they have to review everything, and it takes, I mean, one of the things my authors say is, God help us, it takes 3 months to get a response from one of the major publishers as to whether they want to contract the book or not. This is outrageous. More speed things. Most publishers, English language publishers, no longer respond to unsolicited manuscripts from authors. I completely understand why that is the case, but I took the decision that I will respond, and I respond within 24 hours. Actually, I could respond within 10 seconds, but it looks a bit rude. So I put in at least an hour before saying no. But I do respond. Or, speaking as a small publisher, another rule I made was any invoice I receive, I pay same day, if only the people that I send invoices to paid. And think how many times I have to chase them. This is cost. So I think speed, protection of the environment by not overprinting, by not sending books around the world, by not shifting things on lorries, and it all comes down to speed. Makes me very anxious.
I think that's marvelous. In 2012, we were at the Future Book Conference in London, and Rebecca Smart, who was at the time running Ebury, a very fine imprint now, said to the audience, "We are too bloody slow."
Yeah.
And it was absolutely true then, and it's still absolutely true. It is something that publishing is still dealing with in a world that's getting faster and faster. So maybe that's a good pressure to focus on. But thank you, all of you, for talking with us today about what we're feeling, the anxieties right now. Thank you all for being with us for this, and Javier is coming with the next panel. Louise, shall I lead these here?